Okay, so good morning again. As I was saying, this presentation will be mainly on foreign investment in agriculture and the international policy responses to these investments and their impacts on local community especially. And I will start the presentation with a question on whether going too fast now? Yes, we're getting there. On whether really FDI matters compared to other sources of capital for developing countries. And then after seeing this question, we will review whether really FDI can stimulate local agricultural development, or is it more an obstacle, a barrier to development. Then also how to reduce the risks that are involved with FDI and increase and maximize the benefits. And finally, what tools are available for African countries in terms of international guidance and policy framework that could be of use. So investing in agriculture is amongst the best and the most effective ways of reducing poverty and hunger in the world. This has been demonstrated by many studies, but also interestingly, farmers are by far the largest investors in agriculture. Farmers investing in their own farms, in extending their farms, they really dwarf by size the other sources of investment. You can see from the graph on the right-hand side that this column is basically what farmers invest. It's about $170 billion per year. So it is more than 3 times all other sources combined, government investments, corporations investments, and ODA, official development assistance. You can see that the amount of farmers is by far the most important sources of investment. And also smallholders, they are the ones who produce the food, but they are also the majority of the world's poor. They are the ones who suffer from hunger, quite paradoxically. So it's really key when we talk about reducing poverty, it's really key okay. All right. It's really key to stimulate the investments of small farmers. They are the key partners for reducing hunger and poverty. But how can we do this? We also need investments from governments, public investments that will stimulate small farmers' investments that will support them. We also need investments and enabling policy framework, enabling laws and regulations to help farmers invest more in their farms. Having said this, should we conclude then that foreign investments are useless, that the only important thing is stimulating farmer investments? No, because while in a way foreign investments and companies' investments are very small, as we saw in the graph before, they are still important in terms of qualitative benefits. Foreign investments from companies can bring technology transfer, they can bring new management skills and methods, they can bring standards, adoption of international standards, they can help commercialize some farm productions. So we need also the FDI, even if it's small in quantity, we need foreign investment by corporation also to support the development, even if it's not the priority as we clearly saw. However, having said that, not all the qualitative benefits from foreign investment that I just mentioned will appear automatically. And in some cases, there are also risks and challenges created by foreign investment in agriculture. So in terms of trends, you can see the graph that confirms the information that Ward Answer was showing, that there's been quite a strong investment in foreign investment in agriculture, a strong increase over recent years, especially since 2002. But still, foreign investment in the agricultural sector is less than 5% of total foreign investment. So only a small share of these huge flows of investments go into the agricultural sector. And more importantly, maybe, you can see the top curve. The top curve is about investment in processing, in secondary forms of agriculture, storing, processing, etc., whereas the other curve, the lower one, this is what I tried, but at some point it stopped. Thank you. You can see that investments in the primary production, primary agricultural production, is still missing, basically. It's less than 10% of the total flows. Yet, even though it's less than 10%, there are still important tracts of lands that are concerned by these investments. You could see from Vart's presentation, it's about 32 million hectares of deals, of concluded deals. So this has, in spite of the relative weakness, this has some important implications on African lands. Also, what's interesting is that if we look at global level, we will notice that there's a regional pattern, intra-regional pattern of investment. Namely, investment into Asian countries come mainly from other Asian countries, or investments into Latin American countries come mainly from other Latin American countries. However, in the case of Africa, it's the contrary. Africa is the exception in the sense of most of the investment that come into African countries don't come from other African countries, the foreign investment. They come from other non-African countries, from other continents. So in this respect, Africa is different from the other regions and continents. Now, in order to understand better the trends and the impacts of foreign investment in agriculture, FAO has conducted some case studies that we published in this book that you can find on the tables. There were some this morning. I don't know if there are still a few that can be put on the tables. Thank you. And in this study, we looked mainly at investment in primary production, looking at different types of investment projects and also different types of business model. We looked at large-scale land acquisitions and their impacts on local communities, but we also looked at other types of business models which are more inclusive of local communities and farmers. So what do we know about the impacts of foreign agricultural investment in developing countries? Here I will give a few summary points of these case studies. So first of all, it's important to say that we should be cautious when interpreting the data because it is case studies, so it's not necessarily systematically confirmed. But on the other hand, there's also a growing body of empirical evidence coming from other strands of studies which tend to confirm these findings. There's a high variability of impacts across case and investment projects. And also there's a high variability of determinants of the impacts. Some determinants can be linked to the business model, for instance, the type of business model, the profile of the investor and its aims, the aims of the investors, the level of organization of farmers, the legal and institutional frameworks, the policy, etc., etc. So all these factors are important, and it's very difficult to determine the impacts of an investment a priori. You really need to look at all these parameters. As regards large-scale land acquisitions, what we found is that the disadvantages of this type of investment really outweighs the benefits of this type of investment. It was difficult to find a successful case of large-scale land acquisition. Often, the investors say that there will be job creation, for instance, but the actual benefits that you observe in the field after even several years of investment is very limited. You don't find that many jobs created, and often the quality of the jobs also is poor. There are clearly risks for local communities where land rights are unclear and governance is weak. For instance, the lack of access to natural resources for local people, the negative impacts on rural livelihoods, displacements of local farmers, sometimes they are evicted from their land by the investment, and the lack or even the inadequate compensation given to people who are dispossessed of their land. And all this leads to social conflict and fragmentation in the local communities. On top of these social risks, there are also environmental risks, such as the depletion of natural resources, the degradation of these resources like water, soil, forest, biodiversity, etc. So in the end, what you get as an investor is very high transaction costs to deal with all these problems, and also local opposition by local people who quite rightly do not accept the way the investment was conducted. So all this leads to think that even from the perspective, the very narrow perspective of investors, large-scale land acquisition is not the best business model. Now, there are other types of business models that we have named under the name inclusive business models, which actually cover a wide range of models, it's not just one. And usually these models tend to have more positive impacts, especially when farmers keep control of their land and are involved as active partners on an equal basis to the investors. These models were shown to provide jobs, increase the productivity of small farmers, add value to the agricultural production, and also lead to higher incomes for local people who are involved in the scheme. There's also, more importantly, it's more difficult to evaluate, but more importantly, there's a building of institutional capital in the form of farmer organization, local people organization, etc., which is a very important asset for long-term economic development. Also, it helps investors secure supply without the risks and the cost of acquiring land, the risk that we saw in the previous slide. But not all inclusive business models are successful. And indeed, Ward in his presentation before mentioned that there are very few, the number of such successful cases is very little. So there are reasons also why the number is so little. First of all, the effects and the positive benefits of these business models take a lot of time to emerge because you have high transaction costs, especially if you need to deal with a large number of small farmers with a low education level. It takes a lot of time for the investors and the government partners and the farmers to agree on a deal. There's also an asymmetry between the foreign investor and the local farmers. The foreign investor comes with capital, with maybe a staff of lawyers and experts, which local organizations cannot really afford to have. And there's a lot of learning needs on both sides. On the investor side, who needs to learn about the local area where he or she is investing, and on the small farmer's side also. So basically what we conclude is that it really requires a lot of external support for these inclusive business models to work well and to provide benefits to the host country, the local community, and the investor. So some form of support can be public-private partnerships. We think it's important to involve the government, and also to have a patient capital that does not demand high rates of return and that does not demand immediate return. So what are our recommendations based on the findings of these studies? Well, a key factor is to improve the national framework in African countries. This is very important, and that was clearly shown in the previous two presentations also. So it's important to improve governance, improve transparency, accountability, the rule of law, and participation, to strengthen the policies, the laws, the regulations, and the institutions. So it's important that the policies be more consistent across themselves within a country and more supportive, mutually supportive, to reduce policy loopholes also, where sometimes these honest investors try to get in order to make a deal that will be highly beneficial for them but won't benefit the local community. And also to clarify and protect the rights of local communities, of farmers, including land tenure rights. It's also extremely important to strengthen local organizations, be they organizations of farmers, of the local people, of women, of the youth, because these are really institutional capital that will be extremely important to ensure that the project will work for the benefit of the local community. And it's also important to sensitize the investors themselves that it makes good business sense if the project involves the local people and provides benefit to the local people for the reasons we saw in the previous slides. So that was the level where the national level. What can be said about the international level or the international response to the issues raised by foreign investment in agriculture? There are a number of tools which are either existing or being developed at the moment by the international community, which can be very useful also for African governments in developing their own national framework for responsible investment in agriculture. There are important tools on land tenure, and Sue just presented one from the AU, the land policy guidelines and the principles. There's also, as many of you know, probably the voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of tenure of land, forest, and fisheries, which were adopted last year by the Committee on World Food Security. Actually, it was adopted in 2012 by the Committee on World Food Security. And there are also tools, international tools, that regard more precisely investment, agricultural investment. So these are the PRI, Principles for Responsible Agricultural Investment, the RIE principles that are being developed by the CFS, and the OECD FAO practical guidance for companies on responsible business conduct. So I will focus on these three. So the principles, the PRI, as we usually call them, were proposed by 4 international organizations, namely FAO, IFAD, UNCTAD, and the World Bank in 2010, mainly as a response to the challenge of large-scale land acquisitions in developing countries and the need for increased investment in the agricultural sector. They are purely voluntary principles, and they can help African governments develop laws and negotiate agreements, international investment agreements. They can be used as a checklist, for instance, for assessing an investment proposal. It's important to mention that they are a living document in the sense that they are not final, they are not complete. It's something that is being updated based on the results of field studies. And they've been endorsed by the G20. They were endorsed in 2011 by the G20. Then another tool which is being prepared currently is the CFS, the Principles from the Committee on World Food Security for Responsible Agricultural Investment, that we call CFS RIE. And at the moment, we have a broad and inclusive consultation process to develop these principles. There's been a series of regional consultations. There was one in Africa in November last year, at the end of November. There was one in Europe in December. There's one in Asia this week. There's been one in North America. There will be one for Latin America. So there's a number of regional consultations that include all stakeholders, including farmer organizations. These principles have a broader scope than the PRI that we just saw in the previous slide, because they regard all types of investment in agricultural value chains and food systems. They include foreign and domestic, public and private, small, medium, and large-scale investments. And the potential users are very broad also. It's all stakeholders that are involved in, benefit from, or are affected by agricultural investments. They also build on existing instruments, including the voluntary guidelines on the governance of tenure that I just mentioned, the guidelines on the right to food, and the PRI. And the field testing of the PRI that I mentioned in the previous slide will be fed into these consultations for the CFS RIE. So the two instruments are mutually supportive. In terms of the process, the consultation started in 2012. The final negotiations will take place at FAO in Rome in May this year. And if the consultations are successful, the CFS RIE principle should be endorsed by the CFS in October this year at the CFS plenary meeting. Finally, the last instrument, which is also in the process of being developed, is the OECD FAO Guidance on Responsible Business Conduct along agricultural supply chains. The idea is to have an instrument which will be specific for investors, for businesses, whereas the other two instruments that we saw had a broader scope of potential users. And this guidance will summarize existing standards, including the CFS RIE and the PRI, and provide a clear interpretation showing what are the risks that investors incur when they invest abroad in agriculture, and what are the instruments and the tools that can help them mitigate these risks. It will insist a lot on due diligence, the responsibility of investors to take all the precautionary measures to make sure that no standards will be breached and the risk will be addressed properly. And they will also, the guidance will also emphasize how investors can work jointly with governments, including local governments, and civil society organizations, including local farmer organizations, to conduct their business and their investment responsibly. And this process, which is ongoing, is guided by a multi-stakeholder advisory group, which is made of governments, private companies, and NGOs, civil society organizations. So thank you very much for your attention. Sorry again for the mishap with the presentation. And if you need any information, you can find quite a lot of reports, but also news on these two websites which are there. Thank you very much.